This evening I want to just take up that question about the relationship between God and violence and warfare, and does God bless violence or warfare at all? And I think that one of the reasons it's kind of problematic is that in the Old Testament we've got these narratives of Israel conquering the Holy Land, and the most famous, of course, is the Battle of Jericho. And that story about them circling the city for 7 days, and then 7 times the last time, and they shout, and then they also blow their horns, and the walls fall down. What usually doesn't get included in the story is what happens next, and this is verses 21 and 22, and it says, "As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys." That phrase, devoted to destruction, means they killed everything and everyone, every living thing, except in this case for Rahab and her family, because she had helped the spies. But apart from Rahab, everyone else was killed. And that story gets repeated a number of times in the book of Joshua, and to some extent in Judges. And what's troublesome about it is that it seems that the biblical authors seem to think that this is God's will, that this is what God wanted them to do, is to kill the infidels and to cleanse the Holy Land. And so what has transpired as a result of that in the history of the church is a certain holy war theology that certain people have picked up at certain times. One of the first Christians to do this was the Emperor Constantine. He became a Christian while he was emperor, and when he was fighting at Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, he saw the image of the cross and the phrase, "By this sign you will conquer." And so he took that as God blessing his leadership as an emperor and a general, and that by the sign of Christ he would conquer whomever he was fighting. So he was the first Christian ruler of many to see Christ as the one who blesses his exploits as a soldier, as a general, etc. He was not the last. The Crusades would be another example of that sense of, this is a holy war, it's blessed by God, we're going to drive out the infidels from the Holy Land. In the 16th and 17th century, there were a whole series of wars between Protestants and Catholics in Europe, and on both sides, they felt that the Lord was on their side. The Protestants believed the Lord was on their side to defeat the Catholics, and vice versa. And then here in the Americas, that tragic story of what Christians did to the native tribes, not only here in North America, but also in Central America and South America, the conquistadors and so forth. And so we do have this history of kind of a holy war theology, which would say, yes, Jesus really does bless warfare and violence, that he blesses his people when they go to battle against the forces that are against us. One of the people I found helpful in understanding this is a fellow named René Girard, and he taught at Stanford for years, and he talked about sacred violence across cultures and across the continents, where there's a belief, not only among Christians, but in virtually every religion, that certain kinds of violence are sacred, that God blesses that kind of violence, and it's still with us today. But you have it like in Central America, amongst the Mayans, sacrificing virgins or the most athletic players of games to the gods because the gods needed those sacrifices. And so he said that's a very commonplace thing throughout cultures, and we find some of that in the Old Testament, that notion of sacred violence, that the writers of the Old Testament, at least some of them, I think really did believe God was blessing their military conquests. Well, that didn't, this notion of holy war did not sit well with everyone in the Christian church by a long shot. And one of the first people to wrestle with it was a Christian bishop named Marcion. And Marcion believed that, well, he lived in the middle of the 2nd century. He was a Christian bishop, and he taught that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures and the God of Jesus were different and opposed gods. The God of the Old Testament was a harsh, judgmental God, entirely separate from the merciful God of the New Testament. He entirely rejected the Old Testament as being too Jewish, and all the New Testament writing except 10 of Paul's epistles and an edited version of the Gospel of Luke. So that was his solution, was how do I deal with this violence in the Old Testament? Well, because there are two gods. There's the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, but that's different than the God and Father of Jesus. And so that was his way of dealing with it and saying, no, God does not bless violence, that was this harsh, judgmental, vindictive God, this bloodthirsty God, but in Jesus we find something different. His teaching was rejected and declared heretical by the church in Rome, which is where he presented his ideas. He formed his own sect then called Marcionites, who were judged heretical meaning outside the bounds of orthodoxy, but it survived as a separate Christian movement for a couple of centuries. And the reason that Marcion's teaching was rejected is because of this belief in one God. In the Nicene Creed, we say, I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. And that's part of our Jewish inheritance, that at the heart of Judaism is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one God. And so the whole notion of monotheism was central to the Hebrew Scriptures, and Jesus certainly affirmed that, and the first Christians, that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not different than the God and Father of Jesus, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the same God that we find coming to earth in Jesus. So not two gods or three gods or 10 gods, but just the one God. And then same thing in the second article, we believe in one Lord, Jesus Christ. So one God, one Lord. And so because of that commitment to one God, and that creator then became human in Jesus, Marcion's solution was rejected. Well, what that means, I think, is that if there's only one God, then as the New Testament teaches us, God has been a God of love always. It wasn't like God was mean and angry and vindictive before Jesus came and then had a conversion experience and became loving and kind and wonderful. That if God is a God of love, God has always been a God of love, and that has not changed. What has changed is our understanding of God as humans, and that I think it's important to realize that God's self-disclosure, God's revelation that we have in the Scriptures is cumulative, it's progressive, it unfolded over the centuries, and that the final and most complete revelation is Jesus, who is fully God and fully human, which is to say that for Abraham, for Isaac, for Jacob, for those early patriarchs, what they knew of God was not as much as what was known later at the time of Moses, and then at the time of David, and then at the time of the prophets, that it unfolded, that it accumulated. And then finally when Jesus came, he's the definitive revelation of God, that the most we're going to know about God is in Jesus. And if you want to know what God is like, our best answer is Jesus. Whatever we see and hear Jesus doing, that tells us better than anything else what God is like. And so the change has not been in God, the change has been in our understanding of God. So, to put it another way, everything in the scriptures needs to be run through the mind and heart of Jesus. And we have to ask, what did Jesus do or say when it comes to violence and warfare? So just because something's in the Bible doesn't mean it's binding on us and our faith and life. We have to say, okay, yes, that's in the Bible, but what did Jesus do with that? What did he say? What did he do? And I think it's pretty clear that Jesus did not bless war. He did not bless violence. You go to the Sermon on the Mount, right? Those famous lines about turn the other cheek, love your enemies. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And I think that when it comes to Jesus on the cross, what we see is that Jesus was not the crucifier, he was the crucified. He was not the slayer, he was the one who was slain. He was not the torturer, he was the tortured. And so this notion of God as blessing violence, sacred violence, really gets rejected in Jesus and in the New Testament. And it's really a profound shift that God becomes the one not who is violent, but the one who takes violence into God's own self on the cross, which was revolutionary. I mean, it just turned that whole notion of sacred violence upside down. And so it's pretty hard to argue that the God we know in Jesus blesses warfare and violence when you see Jesus' teachings and when you see what he did on the cross, where he's not the one who afflicted others, but he's the one who was afflicted. You know, not the crucifier, but the crucified. Well, given that, it's not surprising that throughout the history of the church, there has been this pacifist movement. People who are totally opposed to war and will not serve in any way. That was true for most of the first Christians, that they took Jesus at his word when it came to the Sermon on the Mount, and were often martyred for their faith. Here in this picture, you see them in the Roman Colosseum, where they refused to fight back, and if the choice was my life or my faith, I was going to forfeit my life rather than give up my faith and deny Jesus. There was a kind of running debate in those first centuries, first, second, third centuries, about whether a soldier could be saved. Could a Christian be a soldier and actually be involved in combat, in warfare, and still be saved, given what Jesus said? And so there was this ongoing debate about whether it was possible to be a soldier and still be saved. Some of the other movements that have been pacifist, the Quakers, of course, coming out of the Reformation area, the Moravians, the same, another Reformation era group that totally rejected the use of violence. And then in our, in our own time, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was very much committed to resisting evil without resorting to violence. And so that has been a very persistent stream in the history of the church over these last 2,000 years. And the pacifists among us would say, absolutely not. God does not in any way, shape, or form bless warfare or violence or killing or any of that sort of thing. There's a third approach. So you had holy war, no war, and then the third has been just war or justifiable war. And that was developed by St. Augustine around 400 AD. And the reason was Constantine came to faith in Jesus around 312. He was the first Christian emperor of Rome. But then after that, mostly by official decree, the Roman Empire became Christian. And so for the first time, you had Christians who were in positions of power, like the emperor, or generals, or whatever. And that had not happened before. They were not people in power in any way, shape, or form. Suddenly they were. And so it's like, okay, if I'm the Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, can I, as a good Christian, lead my troops out into battle to fight against the Vikings or against the Huns or whomever? And so St. Augustine came up with this notion of just or justifiable war. And what is at the heart of this is this notion that there may be times when resorting to violence is necessary in a tragic, broken world. And that sometimes you have to take a life to save many more innocent lives. But there are very strict conditions under which a Christian can do that. And so there are these criteria, these requirements for something to be a just war. So first of all, it has to be a last resort. So after every other means of resolving the conflict has been exhausted, and this is the only possible alternative. That's one condition, a last resort. It has to be a just cause. It must correct a grave, immediate, and ongoing evil. A valid authority, it must be consistent with a policy or principle, and it must be a duly constituted authority. It can't be you and me just deciding, I'm going to go to, fight this just war. It needs to be a legitimate authority. You have to have some sense of success. You can't send men to die hopelessly. Proportionality, that you need to use only as much force is as necessary, so it's not disproportionate. And there has to be an exit strategy, a way that it's going to end. So that is pretty much what St. Augustine came up with, and that's been used pretty much ever since. Two examples in our own time, the Second World War. When the Holocaust was taking place, if we fought that for no other reason, that would have been justifiable. And the countries that fought against Hitler did because it was unprovoked, it was self-defense, and there was obviously a very great evil that was going on, and it was a just authority, no more force than necessary, and so forth. So that would certainly be one. The other today is, I believe, is the war in Ukraine, that it meets all these conditions, that it was unprovoked, that they are, it is a justifiable cause. They're a duly constituted nation. There's a reason for success. They are not using more force than is necessary. In fact, they're, underwhelmingly in troops and supplies and all that, inferior to the Russians, and an exit strategy. So again, if there is an example of a just or justifiable war, it's certainly the Ukrainians. Does anybody want it? No. Do we wish it were different? Yes. But Putin seems bent on recreating the Russian Empire and being the 21st century version of Peter the Great. So I think there are times when it is justifiable to go to war. On the flip side, you look at what's happening in Israel and Gaza, certainly what was done, initially by Hamas was unjustifiable. I mean, that was just terror, totally unprovoked, totally evil. I think where the Israeli government, the Israeli war cabinet, I think has gone off the rails, is when you come to proportionality, that the killing that they've done so far outweighs what was done initially. And I would, and this is just my pious opinion, but it would be one thing to me if they said we are going to get every Hamas fighter. That's our goal, and that's who we're going after, and trapped them in the tunnels eventually, and eventually, captured or killed all of them. What they've done in Gaza just seems to me to be indefensible. The thing I would liken it to is, when after 9/11, we went after bin Laden and, his guys, which seemed perfectly justifiable to me, a just cause. It would have been different if they had been hiding in Kabul and we would have leveled Kabul with thousands and thousands of bombs. So it's the proportionality thing that I think is where I would critique what the Israeli government or the war cabinet has done. The other thing I'll say is, that the same thing is true for law enforcement. It's really they have very strict conditions under which they can use force, and especially lethal force, right? Last resort after everything else has been exhausted. It's in self-defense. It's got to be proportionate, etc. And to be sure, it's not always that way, and there are examples of excessive use of force, so I don't want to whitewash that. But I think that what at its best is law enforcement officers are trained to use great restraint and judgment and only use as much force as is necessary. And part of that, I think, is because violence has this allure that you can almost get addicted to it, and it can take over, and you get caught up in that, and it can do things to your soul if you're not careful. Which I think is why soldiers and law enforcement officers, and especially leaders, need to be so ethical, deeply spiritual people, so that they don't get to glorify violence or start to love that. I think a just war can bring us a truce. It can bring an end to the fighting and the killing of innocents, and that's no small thing. That when innocents are being killed, to stand by and do nothing doesn't seem to me to be the right response. And so a truce, a stopping of the killing is a good thing, but it can't bring us the peace that we want. It does not bring a just and lasting peace. I think that what does that is the peace of Christ, and that's something different than stopping the firing, stopping the killing. That's a first step, but the peace of Christ is something much different. That word comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means everything is in harmony, everything is working the way God intended it, everything is integrated into one another, that the conflicts, the hatred, the racism, all those things are gone. And you can't do that with weapons. That the reason we don't bless warfare is they cannot bring us the peace of Christ. Weapons are too weak, not too strong. And there will never be peace out there until there is peace in here, because the origin of violence is not out there. It's in here in each one of us. And so I believe Christ is at work in the world not to conquer us by force, but to transform us by the power of his love so that I am at peace and I can do the things that make for peace, that the violence in my heart is finally quelled, and I'm not tempted to think that that's the solution and that's the way to get to peace.